If you stand on the shores of Lake Titicaca, straddling the border of Peru and Bolivia, you are standing at the top of the world. At 3,800 meters above sea level, the air is thin. The ultraviolet radiation is so intense it can burn your skin in minutes. But the water is the real danger. It is vast, deep, and stays a bone-chilling 10 degrees Celsius year-round. Falling into this lake is not just a swim, it is a shock to the system that stops the heart. Now, imagine living here 500 years ago. You are a member of the Uros tribe. You are a small, peaceful people, and you are being hunted. The Inca Empire is expanding, consuming everything in its path. They want your land, your labor, and your submission. To the east, the aggressive Collar Kingdom is raiding your villages. You are trapped between an unstoppable army and an uncrossable body of freezing water. You have no stone to build a fortress. You have no weapons to fight an empire. By all logic, your civilization should end here. You should be wiped from the history books, another casualty of conquest. But you don't die. Instead, you do something that defies physics and sanity. You decide that if the land is too dangerous, you will leave the land behind entirely. You decide to walk onto the water, not for a day, but for a lifetime. To survive, the Uros people had to invent a new kind of geology. They had to build ground where there was only abyss. To understand the magnitude of this decision, you must understand the enemy. The enemy wasn't just the Inca soldiers with their copper maces, it was the lake itself. Lake Titicaca is essentially an inland ocean. It has tides. It has storms that generate waves tall enough to capsize modern boats. It is a hostile, high-altitude environment where resources are scarce. The Uros were distinct from the other tribes. They called themselves the Lupihaks, the sons of the sun. They believed they had black blood that made them immune to the cold. While that is a myth, it speaks to their desperate need to adapt to an environment that kills outsiders. Living on the shore was impossible because it made them visible targets. Living on boats, the traditional balsa rafts, was unsustainable for a whole society. You cannot raise children, cook fire, and weave textiles on a narrow canoe that rocks violently with every ripple. They needed stability. They needed territory. But the lake floor was hundreds of meters down. They couldn't drive piles or build stilts. They needed an island. But islands don't just appear. And in the treeless expanse of the Altiplano, they had no timber to build rafts massive enough to support a village. All they had, stretching for miles along the marshy shallows, was a green, grassy weed. The Totora reed. To the Inca, it was just grass. To the Uros, it was the raw material of survival. Imagine the first struggle. Before the massive islands we see today existed, there must have been a moment of terrifying transition. A family, pushed to the brink by a raiding party, pushes off into the reeds in their small boats. They hide there for a night. Then two. Then a week. The sensory experience is miserable. You are sleeping curled up in a canoe. The smell is pungent, the scent of decaying vegetation and stagnant water. The cold seeps through the bottom of the hull. You cannot light a fire to keep warm because you will burn your boat. You are eating raw fish and the white, starchy bottoms of the reeds just to stay alive. The silence is broken only by the wind rustling the millions of reed stalks, a dry, whispering sound that masks the approach of enemies but also isolates you from the world. They realized that the boat was a prison. They needed to walk. They looked at the reeds surrounding them. Schoenoplectus californicus. It grows thick and tall, sometimes 3 meters high. They tried piling cut reeds together to make a mat, but wet reeds get waterlogged. They sink. A mat of reeds would rot and disintegrate within days, leaving them swimming in the freezing dark. They needed a foundation. They needed something that floated, not because it was light, but because it trapped the very gases of decomposition that defined the swamp. The turning point, the engineering miracle, came when the Uros stopped looking at the green stalks and started looking underneath the water. They discovered the Kili. In the dry season, when the water levels dropped, the massive root systems of the totora reeds would become exposed. These roots are dense, tangled masses of organic matter, soil, and detritus. But the Uros noticed something strange. When the water level rose again, huge chunks of this root mass would break off from the lake floor and bob to the surface like corks. Why? Because the root mass is decomposing. As the old roots die, they release gases, methane and carbon dioxide. These gases get trapped in the dense tangle of the root matrix. The Kili wasn't just a root. It was a natural pontoon filled with millions of tiny gas balloons. This was the aha moment. They realized they didn't have to build a raft. They could harvest the floor of the lake. They could saw these massive blocks of root out of the mud, tie them together, and create a floating tectonic plate. But discovering the material was the easy part. Utilizing it would require a labor so intense it would break the bodies of the uninitiated. The construction of an island is a process of brute force and delicate weaving. It begins in the rainy season. The men go out into the marshes with long, saw-like knives. They locate the prime Kili beds. They have to cut deep into the muck, sawing through the entangled roots. These blocks are enormous. A single block can be 2 meters thick and weigh nearly a ton when wet. Yet, because of the trapped gases, they are buoyant. The tactile sensation is slimy, heavy, and cold. They drag these massive blocks together using ropes made of braided grass. They arrange the blocks in a grid. Then they drive eucalyptus stakes, traded from the mainland, through the blocks to pin them together. They weave rope through the stakes, tightening the grid until the separate blocks act as a single monolithic slab. This base layer is the hull of their ship. It is dark, ugly, and smells of swamp gas. But it is solid. You can walk on it. It feels like walking on a waterbed, a slow, undulating movement. But it is wet. You cannot live on a wet sponge. But then the crisis hits. You have your base. You are floating. But the biology of the lake is relentless. The Kili blocks are dead matter. They are rotting. Slowly, the gas escapes. Slowly, the water infiltrates. If left alone, the island will sink back to the bottom within a year. Furthermore, the weather turns. A storm rolls down from the Andes. The waves on Lake Titicaca can reach 2 meters in height. A rigid raft would snap. A boat would capsize. The Uros families are huddled on this floating patch of roots, watching the grey wall of water approach. They have nowhere to run. They are adrift on a biodegradable raft in a hurricane. But the craziest thing is, the heavier the storm became and the more weight they piled onto the island, the safer they were. This is the paradox of the soft structure. The Uros learned that they had to cover the Kili base with layers of cut reeds, not just a thin layer, but meters of it. They stack the green, hollow stalks in a crosshatch pattern, one layer horizontal, one layer vertical. This is the carpet. As the waves hit the island doesn't fight the wave, it absorbs it. The Kili base is flexible. It undulates over the swells like a sea snake. The thick layer of reeds on top acts as a shock absorber. The water splashes up, but it filters down through the reeds and drains away, never reaching the sleeping skins of the people. The immense weight of the wet roots gives the island inertia. It doesn't flip. It sits low and heavy in the water, riding the storm out with a damp, rhythmic groaning, but never breaking. The refinement of this design is a constant battle against entropy. The Uros realized that the reeds on the bottom of the stack, where they touch the wet roots, rot quickly. The reeds on top dry out in the brutal sun and become brittle. The island is dying from the bottom up and the top down simultaneously. So they developed a continuous cycle of renewal. Every 2 weeks, fresh reeds must be harvested and added to the top layer. This pushes the old reeds down. As the bottom layer rots, it compresses and essentially becomes part of the soil of the island. They are living on a conveyor belt of biomass. The insulation properties are genius. The totora reed is hollow. It is filled with air. This layer of air, trapped in the millions of stalks beneath their feet, insulates them from the freezing lake water. The water is 10 degrees, but the floor of the hut is warm. The decomposing reeds at the bottom also generate heat, an exothermic reaction of decay. The island is a battery that generates its own warmth from the bottom up. They anchored these islands using ropes tied to stakes driven into the lake bed, but these anchors are temporary. If the Incas came, or if the water level rose, they simply cut the rope and drifted away. They were a mobile city. The test of survival was the conquest. When the Inca armies finally reached the shores of Titicaca, they looked out and saw nothing, just miles of reeds. They didn't see the villages hidden deep within the labyrinth of the marsh. When tax collectors eventually tried to find them, the Uros simply moved. They poled their islands into deeper water or into the maze of the Puno Bay. They were the ghosts of the lake. They paid no taxes. They gave no labor. They existed in a blind spot of the empire. There is a historical account that describes the Uros as so poor they had nothing to tax. But this was a misunderstanding of their wealth. Their wealth was their invisibility. Their wealth was the technology that allowed them to exist where no soldier could follow. The result of this engineering is a culture that has outlived the empire that tried to destroy it. The Incas fell to the Spanish. The Spanish Empire collapsed, but the Uros remain. Today, there are still over 1,000 Uros people living on nearly 100 floating islands. The data on the island's load capacity is staggering. A large island can support 10 families, their houses, solar panels, and even schools. The base Kili can last for 30 years before it becomes too waterlogged and must be abandoned. They didn't just survive, they adapted the reeds for everything. They eat the iodine-rich roots to prevent goiter. They use the flour to make tea. They wrap the stalks around their cuts as bandages. The reed is their food, their medicine, their ground, and their home. The Uros' floating islands are a masterclass in refusal. The refusal to submit to enemies and the refusal to accept the geography handed to them. They teach us that land is not the only place civilization can take root. We often think of adaptation as fighting the environment, building dams, digging tunnels. But the Uros didn't fight the water. They became part of it. They understood that if you cannot stand firm on the earth, you must learn to float. They built a world that was meant to rot, accepting that survival is not about building something that lasts forever, but about building something that can be renewed every single day. If you want to discover more forgotten ancient technologies that helped humanity survive, subscribe now and comment below. What type of ancient shelter should we explore next?